From the clash of bronze swords on a sun-scorched plain to the thunder of iron hooves tearing through the dust. From the crack of rifles echoing across muddy trenches to the roar of jet engines above cities swallowed by fire. From the moment humans first learned to kill with purpose, war has walked beside us. It's reshaped empires, toppled kings, and ended civilizations. It has burned itself into our myths, our religions, and our histories. Every age has forged new weapons. Every empire has found new ways to kill. From the stone axe to the steel blade, and from the tank to the mushroom cloud, from whispers in the shadows to drones circling in silence above our heads. War is the great constant of humanity. It changes shape, it changes scale, it changes tools, but it never goes away. And this is the story of how warfare has evolved. Not just the story of weapons, but of ambition, fear, survival, and power. It's a story written in blood across every age of human history, and it begins at the dawn of civilization. The first wars weren't written in books. They were remembered only in scars, in broken bones left in shallow graves, in the silent burial pits of forgotten tribes. Long before nations, before cities, before kings and crowns, there was conflict. Archaeologists have found evidence of battles stretching back over tens of thousands of years. At Jebel Sahaba, along the Nile, a cemetery holds dozens of skeletons. Men, women, children, all pierced by flint-tipped arrows. And this was no accident. It was no hunting mishap. It was slaughter, one of humanity's earliest recorded massacres. War was born not from hatred, but from need. Territory, food, water, resources. When survival was at stake, people banded together, and when those bands collided, they fought. The weapons were simple. A sharpened stick hardened in fire, a stone flaked into a deadly edge. Later, the bow and arrow, allowing death to fly in from a distance. But even in these earlier struggles, something became clear. War was not only about who struck the hardest, it was about who organized, who planned, and who led. By 3000 BC, as agriculture spread and villages grew into towns, war evolved with them. The first empires of Mesopotamia rose between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Here, war was not just survival. It was expansion, ambition, and conquest. Kings gathered armies numbering in the thousands. The Sumerians fought with spears and bronze-tipped axes, their soldiers shielded by rawhide and bronze helmets. And with armies came something new: logistics. Armies needed food, water, weapons, and supplies. Victory was no longer just strength at the moment of the clash, it was endurance and the ability to outlast the enemy, march further, and hold the field. The Egyptians mastered this art. In 1479 BC, Pharaoh Thutmose III marched his army north to face a coalition of Canaanite princes at the Battle of Megiddo. It's the first battle in history we can reconstruct in detail thanks to hieroglyphs carved into stone. Thutmose led his troops through a narrow mountain pass, surprising the enemy. His chariots thundered onto the plain, wooden wheels wrapped in bronze, pulled by horses straining against leather harnesses. Archers loosed volleys of arrows, cutting down men before swords could even clash. The Canaanites broke, fleeing behind the walls of Megiddo. That day, war became something more: a performance, a spectacle, a test of will and cunning. Pharaoh did not just fight, he recorded his victory for eternity, etched into temple walls for his people to see. Other empires learned to wield not only armies, but fear, none more so than the Assyrians. Between the 9th and 7th centuries BC, their armies swept across the Near East. They carried iron weapons, stronger, sharper, and deadlier than bronze. They used battering rams and siege engines to tear down walls. But their greatest weapon was terror. When the Assyrians conquered a city, they made examples of its people. Executions, deportations, floggings, impalements. Their message was clear: resist and suffer, submit and survive. War was no longer just physical, it was psychological. Cities surrendered before the first arrow was fired because they knew what would come if they didn't. But beyond the walls of empires, war was also evolving elsewhere. In China, the Warring States period saw kingdoms clash with armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Crossbows gave soldiers the power to punch through armor at range. Sun Tzu, the philosopher general, wrote The Art of War, a manual not just of battle, but of deception, intelligence, and strategy. All war is based on deception, he wrote. For the first time, war was studied, theorized, and written down as science. Across the world, in the Americas, the Olmecs and later the Maya and Aztecs waged wars of their own. Their weapons were obsidian blades sharper than steel. Their battles were fought not just for territory, but for captives, sacrifices to fuel their gods. War had become entwined with culture, religion, and identity. The essence of war was changing. No longer the desperate struggle of survival between wandering tribes, it was now organized, ritualized, politicized. Rulers used it to expand their power, project dominance, and secure their place in history. But for all the grandeur of empires and the carvings of kings, the human cost would never change. Beneath the walls of Megiddo, corpses rotted in the sun, and in Assyrian cities, prisoners marched in chains to exile. In forgotten fields, far from records and monuments, farmers and shepherds fell under the spears of invaders. Their stories were lost to time. The birth of war was not a single moment. It was a long and brutal evolution. From sharpened stones to iron blades, from tribal clashes to empire-building conquests. And yet one truth bound it all together. War was never just about weapons. It was about fear, control, and about survival. But more than that, it was all about power. The ancient world was a battlefield of ideas as much as weapons. It was here, in the lands of Greece, Carthage, and Rome, that war became a science, a matter of formations, strategy, and discipline. It began with the Greeks. The hoplite phalanx was more than a military tactic, it was a philosophy. Rows of heavily armored infantry, each man carrying a round shield, a long spear, and the weight of his neighbor's life. Shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked into a wall of bronze and wood, and their spears jutted out like the teeth of a beast. Individually, a hoplite was vulnerable, but together they were nearly invincible. It was a formation that required trust, unity, and discipline, a reflection of the Greek polis itself. At Marathon in 490 BC, this discipline met the tide of empire. The Persian king Darius sent an army across the sea to crush Athens. The Athenians, vastly outnumbered, formed up on the plain. When the order came, they charged. Not the slow, measured march of old, but a full sprint, shields braced and spears pointed forward. They slammed into the Persian line with such ferocity that the invaders broke. Against all odds, the Athenians won, and in doing so, they proved something that would echo across history, that discipline and unity could triumph over sheer numbers. Decades later, Alexander of Macedon would carry this lesson further than anyone before him. His army was a symphony of arms. The Macedonian phalanx had spears twice the length of the Greek hoplites, and they formed an unyielding core. Cavalry swept around the flanks, archers and slingers filled the skies with missiles, and siege engines battered city walls. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, Alexander faced Darius III and the might of Persia. The Persian army outnumbered him, perhaps 5-1, and yet Alexander's tactics were flawless. He feigned weakness, drawing the Persians to one flank, and then drove his cavalry like a blade straight into the heart of the enemy line. Darius fled and his empire crumbled. War was no longer just about brute force, it was choreography, a dance of precision and deception. Rome learned this lesson and perfected it. The Roman legion was not just an army, it was a machine. Flexible, disciplined, relentless. Soldiers trained for years, drilled until every moment was instinct. Each legion could adapt to terrain, enemy tactics, and to the chaos of battle. Where the Greek phalanx was rigid, the legion could bend without breaking. But Rome's greatest weapon was not the sword. It was logistics. Roman legions could march 20 miles in a day, carrying their supplies, and then build a fortified camp before nightfall. They could sustain campaigns for months, even years, far from home. Roads and aqueducts fed their armies, supply chains stretched across continents. Rome didn't just win battles, it wore enemies down until resistance itself became impossible. Yet even Rome, even at the height of its power, would eventually meet its match. In 216 BC, on the fields of Cannae, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal delivered one of the most devastating defeats in military history. Facing a Roman army twice his size, Hannibal placed his weakest troops at the center, drawing the Romans in. As they pushed forward, his cavalry crushed their flanks, encircling them completely. What followed was slaughter. Up to 70,000 Romans killed in just a single day, an entire army destroyed. The double envelopment at Cannae remains one of the most studied maneuvers in military history, a brutal lesson that even the mightiest war machine could bleed. But war in the classical world was more than just battlefields. It was politics, power, and survival. The Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage were not fought only with swords, but with trade, with alliances, and with propaganda. Victory was as much about breaking an enemy's will as it was about killing his soldiers. And it was culture. In Greece, the hoplite reflected the ideals of the citizen soldier. In Rome, the legionnaire embodied the might of the empire. War became part of identity, part of destiny. The battlefield had become a laboratory of innovation. Spears lengthened, armor strengthened, formations adapted. Generals became tacticians, politicians, and visionaries all in one. The tools of war were sharper, but more importantly, the minds behind them were sharper still. By the end of the classical age, war had become not just a contest of armies, but of systems. And the system that could adapt the fastest and endure the longest would rule the world. The fall of Rome left Europe fractured. Kingdoms rose and fell, borders shifted like sand, and in the chaos, war took on a new shape. This was the age of the castle. Stone fortresses crowned hills and river crossings, their towers looming as symbols of power and protection. To take a castle was to take control of the land around it, and so medieval warfare became a game of endurance, of siege and starvation. Armies gathered not just to fight, but to wait. Weeks, months, sometimes years. Wooden siege towers creaked forward, covered in wet hides to resist flaming arrows. Battering rams capped in iron slammed endlessly against wooden gates. Trebuchets hurled stones weighing hundreds of pounds, smashing into walls and sowing terror inside. But often it was hunger that would decide the outcome. A besieged garrison might endure arrows and stones, but it couldn't endure famine. In the Middle Ages, patience was a weapon as sharp as any sword. Still, open battle remained, brutal, bloody, and dominated by the knight. Clad in chainmail, later in plate armor, mounted on war horses, knights were the shock troops of the medieval world. Their charge could shatter infantry lines, and their skill in combat made them damn near invincible. In the Middle East, the Crusades turned religion into fuel for war. Armies bearing the cross marched to Jerusalem, clashing with Muslim defenders under leaders like Saladin. These wars were not only about land, they were about faith, identity, and destiny. And though knights and kings would march for glory, it was often ordinary people who paid the price. Villages burned, cities sacked, and fields turned to ash. For centuries, it ruled the battlefield. But technology is the eternal enemy of tradition, and in Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen faced the French nobility. Arrows rained down in sheets, piercing armor, felling horses, breaking the charge before it could land. Nearly 40 years later at Agincourt, it happened again. In a field with choked mud, French knights sank beneath the weight of their armor as English archers cut them down. The age of the knight, proud, honor-bound, seemingly unassailable, was crumbling. Even as arrows tore through armor, another revolution was rising: gunpowder. Imported from China, gunpowder transformed European warfare. Cannons roared against castle walls, blasting apart fortifications that had stood for centuries. Fortresses once thought impregnable were reduced to rubble in mere hours. The very foundation of medieval defense, the castle, was suddenly obsolete. The shift was unstoppable. As handheld firearms emerged, the balance tilted even further. A peasant with a musket could kill a knight whose armor cost a fortune in a heartbeat. The monopoly of the nobility over violence was ending. War was becoming cheaper, louder, and deadlier. But the Middle Ages were not defined by Europe alone. Across the steppes, Mongol horsemen swept across Asia in the 13th century. Their armies moved faster than anyone had thought possible, living off the land, riding for days without rest, shooting arrows from horseback with terrifying accuracy. Under Genghis Khan, they built the largest contiguous empire in history, conquering from China to Hungary. Their genius lay in mobility, in psychological terror, and in communication. Messages could race across their empire faster than any European army could march. In Japan, the samurai emerged as the warrior elite. Guided by Bushido, the way of the warrior, they lived lives of loyalty and discipline, wielding the curved katana and the deadly yumi bow. Their wars were very much about honor and ritual, as much as they were about victory. Like their European counterparts, they were warriors bound by code, but they too would one day face the same fate: the arrival of firearms. The Middle Ages were an age of contrast, a time of chivalry and cruelty, of knights in shining armor and peasants ground beneath the mud, of castles rising like mountains and cannons tearing them apart. It was an era when tradition fought its last great battle against innovation and lost. By the dawn of the Renaissance, the thunder of gunpowder had changed the world. The knight was fading, the castle crumbling, and war was marching into a new age. In 16th century Europe, the Spanish perfected a new system, the tercio. It was a formation of pikemen, protecting ranks of musketeers, supported by cavalry and artillery. Each tercio was a moving fortress, bristling with spears and firepower. Against it, cavalry charges broke, infantry lines shattered. For more than a century, the tercio dominated European battlefields. The wars of this age were savage. The 30 Years' War, beginning in 1618, consumed Central Europe. What began as a religious struggle between Catholics and Protestants became a contest of empires. Armies marched across the continent, pillaging, burning, starving villages into submission. Entire regions were depopulated, cities were destroyed, and the scale of suffering was immense. But amidst the horror, innovation marched forward. Artillery grew more powerful. Muskets became lighter and faster to reload. Drill and discipline replaced the chaos of medieval levies. Soldiers no longer fought in masses of individuals, but as part of a machine. Lines of musketeers firing in volleys, ranks rotating with precision, pikes braced against the charging cavalry. Standing armies emerged. Kings no longer relied on calling up feudal vassals. They built permanent forces, professional soldiers trained, uniformed, and paid. War was becoming not a seasonal event, but a constant institution. As armies grew, so too did the need for organization. Supply trains carried food, powder, and shot. Fortifications evolved into star-shaped bastions, angled walls designed to deflect cannon fire. War was becoming a science, calculated, engineered, and planned. And then, at the dawn of the 19th century, came a man who would change everything: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's armies were unlike anything Europe had ever seen. He harnessed the power of mass conscription, raising vast forces from across France. His soldiers marched light and fast, supplied not only by wagons, but what they could take from the land. Speed became his greatest weapon. At Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon faced combined armies from Austria and Russia. He appeared weak, retreating, inviting his enemies to attack, and when they moved forward, he struck. French forces surged into the center, splitting the enemy in two and driving them into chaos. In a single day, Napoleon destroyed two empires' hopes of victory. His campaigns rewrote the rules. He used artillery not as support, but as the hammer of decision. He concentrated his forces at critical points, delivering an overwhelming blow. He moved faster, struck harder, and thought bigger. But Napoleon's genius carried a price. His wars dragged across Europe and consumed nations. At Borodino in 1812, his army clashed with the Russians in one of the bloodiest battles of the era. Tens of thousands died in just a single day of cannon fire, musket volleys, and desperate charges. And though Napoleon did take Moscow, the Russian winter and scorched earth bled his army white. Only a fraction would survive the retreat. 3 years later, at Waterloo, the tide returned. British, Prussian, and Allied forces crushed the French Emperor once and for all. But his legacy endured. Napoleon had shown the world that war could be fought not as slow campaigns of attrition, but as lightning strikes, as movements of entire nations in arms. The early modern era had transformed war utterly, and leaders like Napoleon had proven that war was no longer just a contest of armies, but a contest of nations. The stage was set for something darker, something greater. For when industry and war would meet, the world would never be the same. The 19th century was an age of invention. Steam, steel, and electricity transformed daily life and transformed war. For millennia, armies had marched at the pace of a man, or at best, the gallop of a horse. But now railways carried troops and supplies across continents in days. Telegraph wires carried orders in minutes instead of weeks. Rifled muskets fired faster, further, and deadlier than anything that had come before, and it became clear that industry was remaking the battlefield. The Crimean War of the 1850s gave the world a grim preview. British, French, Ottoman, and Russian armies clashed in brutal sieges like Sevastopol. The rifle musket tore apart charges that would once have carried the day. The telegraph allowed generals and politicians thousands of miles away to direct battles in near real time. And for the first time ever, war was captured not in paintings, but in photographs, frozen images of dead soldiers and ruined landscapes that brought the horror home. And then came America. The Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was a turning point in military history. It was the first great industrial war. Both North and South mobilized entire societies, raising armies of unprecedented size. Factories churned out rifles and cannons, ironclad ships, and railroads carried armies from battle to battle. The telegraph linked President Lincoln directly to the front lines. The battles were unlike anything seen before. At Gettysburg, tens of thousands clashed across rolling hills, rifled artillery blasting men apart from miles away. At Antietam, in a single day, 23,000 fell. It was the bloodiest day in American history. And in the trenches of Petersburg, the world glimpsed the future. Soldiers dug into miles of earthworks, firing across no man's land in scenes that foreshadowed the Great War to come. The Civil War also showed how industry could grind down an enemy. General Sherman's march to the sea was not just a campaign against soldiers, but against the South's ability to fight at all. Railroads torn up, crops burned, factories destroyed. War was becoming total, aimed not only at armies, but at societies. Europe too was changing. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War erupted. Prussians mobilized with unprecedented speed, their railways delivering armies to the front with precision. Their breech-loading rifles and modern artillery outclassed the French. At Sedan, an entire French army and its emperor were captured in a single day. The war was short, decisive, and devastating. It showed that with the right combination of technology, discipline, and organization, nations could win lightning victories. But the lesson was misleading. Leaders looked at Sedan and believed future wars would be quick and glorious. They ignored the deeper truth of the Civil War and Crimea. The technology was making defense stronger, killing faster, and attrition inevitable. Meanwhile, industry kept on feeding the fire. Repeating rifles, machine guns, heavy artillery, ironclads gave way to steel battleships bristling with guns. Armies grew into the millions, and conscription became the norm, tying entire populations to the fate of war. By the turn of the century, Europe was a powder keg. Alliances bound nations together in webs of obligation. Militaries swelled with pride and ambition. Factories stood ready to pour out weapons on an unimaginable scale, and in the shadows, a new doctrine was forming. War was not only about soldiers in uniform, but about nations, economies, and the will of entire peoples. The age of industrial war had arrived. The world had seen glimpses, Crimea, America, Sudan, but no one yet understood the scale of what was to come. When the fuse was lit in 1914, the explosion would shake the earth. That spark came in Sarajevo. A gunshot, an archduke dead, and with him the fragile peace of Europe. What followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Within weeks, nations mobilized millions. Armies marched to war with banners flying, bands playing, and crowds cheering. Soldiers believed they'd be home by Christmas, but by winter's end, the reality had set in. This war would not be quick, it would not be glorious. It would be a slaughter. The first months saw movement. The German Schlieffen Plan swept through Belgium, aiming to crush France in weeks, but at the Marne, French and British forces held the line. The front stabilized, and then it froze. Soldiers dug into the earth. Shallow trenches became networks stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. The age of the maneuver was over, and the age of attrition had begun. Life in the trenches was misery carved into mud. Rats the size of cats, lice burrowing into seams of uniforms. The stench of unwashed bodies mixed in with rotten flesh. Soldiers lived in knee-deep water, with feet swelling and blackening with trench rot. Shells screamed overhead day and night, artillery barges lasting for days and weeks without end. And when the whistle blew, they went over the top, climbing ladders into machine gun fire, walking into barbed wire, and running across no man's land only to be cut down in swathes. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, British troops advanced after a week-long bombardment meant to destroy German forces. But the shells had failed. The wire still stood. The machine guns waited. On the first day alone, nearly 60,000 British casualties made this the bloodiest day in the history of their army. At Verdun, the French and German armies fought for 10 months. "They shall not pass," the French commander declared, and they didn't. But the price was unimaginable. More than 700,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. A battlefield reduced to lunar landscapes, trees splintered into stumps, and soil churned into dust. Villages were erased from the map. Technology made killing relentless. The machine guns skied down entire companies in seconds. Artillery became the true king of the battlefield, accounting for the majority of casualties. Shells buried men alive, shredding them into fragments, and drove survivors mad with the constant thunder. Poison gas, chlorine, phosgene, mustard would turn the air into a weapon. Men drowned in their own lungs or clawed at their blistered skin. New inventions tried to break the stalemate. The British rolled out the tank in 1916, lumbering iron monsters that crushed wire and crossed trenches. Crude and unreliable, but a glimpse of the future. Aircraft, first used for reconnaissance, soon carried machine guns and bombs. The war now reached the skies. But still, the slaughter dragged on. Millions conscripted, millions fed into the grinder. Empires were strained. Families at home rationed their food and waited for sons that would never return home. Propaganda told them it was all worth it, but the graves told another story. By 1917, exhaustion had set in. The Russian Empire collapsed in revolution, its soldiers deserting the front. The United States entered the war, bringing fresh troops and industry to the Allies, and slowly the balance shifted. In 1918, Germany launched one final gamble, the Spring Offensive. Stormtroopers surged through trenches with grenades and flamethrowers, breaking open the front. For a moment, it seemed victory was in sight, but the offensive bled Germany dry, and when Allied forces counterattacked, supported by tanks, aircraft, and American reinforcements, the German army collapsed. On the 11th of November 1918, the guns fell silent, and the Great War was over. But nothing was the same. 9 million soldiers were dead, 21 million wounded. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires were shattered, and landscapes across Europe were scarred beyond recognition. It was meant to be the war to end all wars, but instead it was just the opening act of something far worse. The First World War proved a brutal truth. When industry and nationalism meet on the battlefield, the result is not victory, but annihilation. The Great War might have been followed by silence, but it was certainly not peace. The treaties left bitterness, borders redrawn, nations humiliated, and in the ruins, the seeds of something even darker started to take root. The storm would eventually break. Germany unleashed a new kind of war, blitzkrieg, lightning war. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moved in coordination, fast and overwhelming. Poland would fall in weeks. Denmark and Norway crumbled. France, thought invincible behind its Maginot Line, would collapse in just 6 weeks. Entire nations overrun before they could even comprehend the speed of it all. But Britain stood defiant, even when the skies above turned to battlefield in the Battle of Britain. German bombers filled the night, raining destruction on London and Coventry, but the RAF held firm. Radar guided Spitfires and Hurricanes into the fight, and for the first time, Hitler was stopped. In 1941, the war widened. Germany invaded the Soviet Union as part of Operation Barbarossa, launching the largest military invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers would surge east. Villages were burned, cities would fall, and millions were killed or captured. The Red Army reeled. But in the ruins of Moscow, in the ashes of Stalingrad, the tide would turn. Stalingrad was hell on earth. Streets fought over brick by brick, snipers haunting in the rubble. Soldiers were freezing, starving, killing in basements and factories. The German Sixth Army was surrounded, trapped in the winter cold. In February 1943, they surrendered. 250,000 men lost. Stalingrad became the grave of German ambition. 6 months later came Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. Thousands of Panzers and T-34s clashed across fields, mined and scarred by artillery. In the end, the Soviet counterattack rolled west, pushing Germany back toward Berlin. Meanwhile, the war raged across the seas and the skies. In the Atlantic, German U-boats hunted convoys, starving Britain of supplies, while radar, sonar, and escort carriers turned the tide. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Corps dueled with the British under Montgomery. At El Alamein, the Allies finally broke through, and the Desert War ended. The invasion of Europe was then set in motion. On the 6th of June 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history stormed the beaches of Normandy. D-Day. American, British, Canadian, and Allied troops waded into machine gun fire, with shells tearing apart sand and surf. By nightfall, the beachheads were secure. Europe's liberation had begun. In the Pacific, the war took another form. At sea, aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the rulers of the waves. At Midway in 1942, American codebreakers turned the tide, sinking 4 Japanese carriers and crippling Japan's fleet. And from then on, the Allies advanced island by island. Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle a bloodbath, each island wrestled at a staggering cost. The war in the Pacific revealed another truth. When nations fought to the last, the price was unimaginable. On Iwo Jima, nearly 7,000 Americans died. 20,000 Japanese fought almost to the last man, and in Okinawa, over 200,000 soldiers and civilians perished. By 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Allies pushed from the west, the Soviets from the east. Berlin became a ruin of fire and rubble. Hitler retreated to his bunker, and in April, he was found dead by his own hand. A week later, Germany would surrender. Europe would celebrate, but the war wouldn't be over yet. In the Pacific, Japan still fought on. In July of 1945, Allied leaders demanded unconditional surrender, but Japan refused, and so the world would go on to witness the most terrible weapon ever created. On the 6th of August, an American bomber dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima. In an instant, a city vanished. Tens of thousands killed in a flash. 3 days later came Nagasaki, another city destroyed, and the age of atomic warfare had well and truly begun. On the 15th of August 1945, Japan surrendered and the Second World War was over. But the cost defied comprehension. More than 70 million dead, cities erased, genocide industrialized, nations broken, and empires ended. This war changed everything. It proved the power of combined arms, speed, and coordination. It elevated air power and sea power to new heights. It showed the world that civilians were no longer safe and that entire populations were now genuine targets. And it unveiled the bomb, a weapon so powerful it threatened not just armies, but civilization itself. World War II was not just the largest war in history, it was also the crucible of the modern war. The map had been redrawn. The United States and the Soviet Union rose as superpowers, and the shadow of the mushroom cloud would hang over humanity for generations to come. The Second World War might have ended, but the Cold War had just begun. The guns had fallen silent, but the world was not at peace. Two superpowers now stood above all others, the United States and the Soviet Union, allies in victory, but rivals in ideology. Between them lay a chasm, democracy and capitalism on one side, communism and authoritarian control on the other. And both held the most terrible weapon ever devised, the atomic bomb. World War II had ended with mushroom clouds over Japan, and the Cold War had begun in its shadow. At first, it was fear. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly. The arms race had begun. Bombs grew bigger and deadlier. By the 1950s, hydrogen bombs capable of destroying entire cities in seconds were tested. By the 1960s, nuclear stockpiles numbered in the thousands, enough firepower to obliterate humanity many times over. This was the age of mutually assured destruction. Neither side could strike without guaranteeing its own annihilation, and so the world balanced on a knife's edge, a constant stalemate held by the fear of total destruction. But the Cold War was never cold for those caught in between. Instead of direct confrontation, the superpowers fought through proxies. In Korea from 1950 to 1953, the first great clash of the Cold War erupted. Communist North Korea, backed by China and the Soviet Union, invaded the South. American and US forces intervened. The war seesawed back and forth. Brutal fighting, frozen winters, and cities destroyed. In the end, there was an uneasy armistice. The peninsula divided at the 38th parallel. The Cold War had drawn its first bloody line, and then came Vietnam. The jungles of Southeast Asia became a battlefield where ideology met insurgency. Guerrilla fighters, supplied by the Soviet Union and China, faced the most advanced military on Earth. Napalm and helicopters, B-52 bombers and N-16 rifles, against tunnels, traps, and sheer endurance. The United States poured 500,000 troops into Vietnam, but still the war dragged on. Villages were burned, millions killed or displaced. And when American forces finally withdrew, the images of helicopters lifting off from Saigon became a symbol of superpower vulnerability. Beyond the battlefields, the Cold War reached into every corner of life. Espionage became a weapon. The CIA and KGB fought in the shadows. Coups, assassinations, propaganda. Satellites orbited above, watching every missile silo and monitoring every movement of troops. The space race was more than exploration. It was a contest of technology, prestige, and power. And always the threat of nuclear war lurked. In 1962, the world came closer than ever during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet missiles placed on Cuban soil 90 miles from Florida. For 13 days, the world held its breath. American ships blockaded the island, Soviet vessels steamed towards them, and then, at the very last moment, A deal. The missiles withdrawn, the nuclear war averted. Barely. But not all crises ended in peace. In Afghanistan, Soviet tanks rolled across the border in 1979. For nearly a decade, they fought a grinding war against Afghan fighters, the Mujahideen, armed and funded by the United States. Mountains swallowed Soviet columns. Guerrilla ambushes drained their strength. It became the Soviets' own Vietnam, a bleeding wound that helped bring down their empire. Technology evolved constantly. Nuclear submarines prowled the ocean, silent and unseen, each carrying enough missiles to end civilization. Intercontinental ballistic missiles stood ready in underground silos, their launch orders only ever just minutes away. Jets screamed through the skies faster than sound. Computers entered the battlefield. And in laboratories, scientists worked on new frontiers, satellites, precision-guided weapons, and even the first glimpses of cyber war. Yet, for all its power, the Cold War was as much about perception as reality. Propaganda painted enemies as monsters, stoked fear, and demanded loyalty. Children practiced duck and cover drills, crouching under desks as if it would shield them from a nuclear fire. Families built fallout shelters, the possibility of annihilation hanging over them every moment, a constant reminder of how fragile peace truly was. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union was faltering, its economy stagnating, its empire straining. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most visible symbol of division, was torn down by the hands of ordinary people. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The Cold War ended not with a final battle, but with exhaustion. And yet its shadow remained. The weapons were never destroyed. The nuclear arsenals still waited, silent and ready. The strategies, the lessons, the scars, all carried forward. The Cold War taught the world that the war was no longer just sport with bullets and bombs. It could be fought with ideology, economics, with fear itself. And though it ended without nuclear fire, the possibility never disappeared. The 20th century had seen 2 world wars and a third that simmered just below the surface. And as the Cold War faded, a new century dawned, one where technology would redefine the battlefield yet again. Television allowed elements of the Vietnam War to be broadcasted after the fact, but for the Gulf War, the world was able to watch on while the conflict unfolded live. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, a coalition led by the United States would respond. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of troops, tanks and aircraft gathered in the desert. When the assault began, the world saw a spectacle unlike anything before. Cruise missiles streamed through the night sky, their cameras transmitting every second. Stealth bombers struck targets with precision. Armored columns sliced across the sand at blistering speed. It was a demonstration of what technology could really do. Satellites guided missiles into targets with pinpoint accuracy. Networks of computers and radios coordinated movements in real time. In just 100 hours of ground combat, the war was over. The message was clear. The battlefield had entered the information age. But victory in the desert gave a false impression that wars would be short, sharp, and bloodless. The new century shattered that illusion. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the United States and its allies launched a global war on terror. In Afghanistan, the Taliban regime fell quickly. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein was toppled within weeks. But toppling a government was not the same as winning a war. Insurgencies erupted, guerrilla fighters melted into cities and mountains, improvised explosive devices struck convoys, and years of occupation dragged on. The most advanced militaries on Earth found themselves bleeding against enemies who used patience, terrain, and time as weapons. Technology killed from afar, drones circling silently, guided missiles fired from a distance. But brutes on the ground still paid the price. Afghanistan became America's longest war, stretching over 2 decades. Modern war blurred the lines between the front line and the home front. Cyber attacks struck power grids, banks, leading elections. Terrorist attacks brought violence into city streets far from any battlefield. Satellites mapped every inch of Earth, turning privacy into a memory. In the skies, drones became a new symbol of dominance. invisible killers hovering thousands of feet above. Yet the human element never vanished. Soldiers still patrolled villages, knocked on doors, and carried comrades on stretchers. War, no matter how advanced, still came down to people. But now, the future looms large. Artificial intelligence is being woven into weapon systems. Autonomous drones capable of hunting without human control are on the rise. Algorithms that can analyze battlefields in seconds are now a thing. Hypersonic missiles that travel faster than sound, leaving no time for defense, are in the works, and space itself is becoming militarized. Satellites no longer just eyes, but potential weapons. Some believe these technologies will make war cleaner and more precise, but others fear they'll make it easier and far more deadly. In the end, one truth remains: war adapts, always. From sharpened stone to nuclear fire, from tribal raids to cyber attacks, from the first spear thrown in anger to the insidious world of cyber warfare, warfare has never stopped evolving. Every innovation in human history has gone on to be turned into a weapon. The question to ask is not what the next change to war will be, but whether humans will survive it. For more epic tales from the War Stories archive, hit that subscribe button to enlist today. Then, pick one of the stories on screen to select your next mission. Over and out, soldier.